Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Peter Van Doren. Peter is the editor of the quarterly journal Regulation and an expert on regulation of housing, land, energy, the environment, transportation, and labor. That's a lot. What this title doesn't convey is that Peter in practice is the keeper of all economic knowledge at Cato Institute. If anyone has a question about economics or would like to know what article to read on a given topic, they go to Peter. This obviously is super impressive and really cool, but that's not all. What few people know about Peter is that he and his wife Catherine make the best pizza around here and maybe even in the United States, who knows. And I have been lucky to be able to eat their pizza for years and years. Welcome, Peter.
Well, thank you for that fabulous introduction, Juliet. I'm very pleased to be talking with you today.
So, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
I have thought, since you asked me to do this interview, you've asked me to think about these questions, and I've been wrestling very hard with them. And so I have two possible answers. One is when I was your age, I thought that if I read more and took more classes, that eventually I would figure things out. And somehow once I mastered knowledge, then I would feel better and would have a sense of accomplishment. And yet, 40 some odd years after I had those thoughts, now I realize that may have been like Don Quixote chasing the windmill, which is I've read and read and read and read, and yet I think I know less today than I knew 40 years ago. And I don't mean that in the negative sense. I just mean that academic life and scholarship is very complicated stuff. And the more I read, the more I realize how little I know. And because life is complicated, the world is complicated, and I now am more humble than I was, I think, at an early age when I thought, oh, I'd mastered this or that or the other thing. So that's answer number one. Answer number two is a very econ answer. And given your interests and the previous people you've had on this broadcast and your mother's occupation, I'll give it to you, which is prices matter a lot. And that's a fundamental concept in economics, but it's really, really, really true. But people don't like prices. So prices matter a lot. And then what lots of life is about is the fact that people don't like prices and the information they convey. And that even though prices are very important, we end up fussing a lot about prices over and over and over again. So those are my two answers to the same question, and they're very different. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
I like them. And we're going to talk a bit about prices later. I would say it's a bit more complicated than just prices, but at the same time, it's just prices. So we'll get into that later. A surprise for later. So first, I want to talk about science. And you're a science guy. You like data and stuff, and you come from MIT. You love data analysis. You lament that policy people aren't rigorous enough. and they don't look into enough data. And yet, you aren't convinced by statements like the one by astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson that, quote, all policy shall be based on the weight of evidence, end quote. By that, he means, I think, that science and scientists and what they find and think should determine what government policy should be, especially when it comes to the environment or whatever they're talking about. As lots of people say, that what we do in policy should follow the data. As you told Trevor Burrus and Aaron Powell over at Free Thoughts, quote, science is necessary and important in decisions and policy decisions, but it is not sufficient, end quote. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I mean it's in the environment and now in the pandemic. There's a great yearning, or there's a great, I call it dinner party conversation stylized fact, which is every middle and upper middle class conversation lately suggests somehow the world would be better off if only scientists were also decision makers, and that politicians and others, people with humanities backgrounds or legal backgrounds, if they were in the background, somehow life would be better. And the Neil deGrasse Tyson quote you gave epitomizes that exactly, and he's a very famous scientist. What science can do at its best is say, if the following experiment is true, or if the following data analysis is true, then certain causal consequences follow, right? If we there are thermodynamic, there are laws of physics and things in biology, and then there are things in economics which aren't quite like that. But um, like in economics, demand curves slope down. If prices go up, demand goes down. Things like that. So the question is, what policy conclusions can come out of those things? And I argue that uh, that there's a belief in what I call the false therefore, in my view, uh, out of positive experiments or positive statistical inference, only positive things can be inferred. That is, if we do this, then this follows. The question of whether we should do this, either individually or collectively, depends on adding in additional value concerns out that aren't really scientific. So I'll give you even a statistical example. Um, if you learn, take basic statistics and then econometrics, you'll learn that we try to judge whether a statistical result or a result of an experiment is sufficiently different from a control group so that we are confident that the result is real rather than just the result of random variation around no effect. And we typically have what's called a 95% confidence interval that surround such statistical inferences. And we say if zero is included in that 95% confidence interval, we can't be 95% confident that, in fact, the underlying truth is real rather than just random variation around nothing. Well, is that a scientific choice or not? The answer, in other words, how large should your confidence interval be in your experiment or your statistical exercise? What most people don't realize is that 95% confidence interval is in fact arbitrary. We could be 99% confident, we could be 99.9% confident, we could be 99.9999% confident, or we could be 80% confident or 76.5% confident. The why it is that we came to accept 95% confidence as the appropriate measure of a real scientific conclusion rather than garbage is in fact a kind of sociological and historically interesting factual exercise, but it's not science. It's a value judgment about how worried we ought to be about false positive versus false negative errors, and that is not a scientific question. It's a value question. And I'll go on to give one extreme example. I read about the development of the use of the accelerator in Geneva, the bubble chamber, to search for the Higgs boson. You know, the famous thing in particle physics that a guy named Higgs got a Nobel Prize for. And I didn't realize that in particle physics, right, they fire the accelerator and then they shoot particles at each other and then they examine the bubble chamber, the tracks in this uh, experimental device. And do you know in physics, they need to be 99.999. I forget how many nines there are, but their confidence interval is different than social science. And I said to myself, oh my goodness, if economics required 99.999% confidence in results, we wouldn't have any. There wouldn't be any. And so listeners need to understand that values enter even perfect science. And then, even if you believe a scientific result, you then have to weigh other values in order to get to a policy conclusion about we should do X or Y or Z.
So then, if um if
Thunderstorm.
science is if science is good at providing a set of facts and producing data, but it's different than designing a good policy or the right policy, what is the best way to do that, to create policy based on these facts? Can you tell us about how cost benefit analysis would fit into all of this, should or does, when making policy recommendations?
So people vary as to how risk averse they are, right? And so lots of policy questions involve environmental pollution and or health and safety calculations. And so at its best, what epidemiology and science can do is inform each of our individual preferences about should I take this vaccine? So let's say the rate of side effects for a medicine is, 1 in 1,000. You know, 1 in 1,000 people suffer severe side effects from taking a medication. Some people would find that risk acceptable, and some would not, given the benefit, whatever benefit would result from taking that medication. So, at an individual level, it's at least plausible that people can take the results of science and then, given their own view of their own values and their own notion of costs and benefits, they can make their own decisions about how to lead their life or to go to different things. Is it worth it to drive a race car around at 200 miles an hour on the weekend to try to earn a living, i.e., NASCAR or IndyCar racing, or in Europe, Formula One? Each of us would have a different conclusion about that, but since it's a private good, uh, some people race cars and find that to be an okay way of making a living given the risks, and other people don't. The difficulty comes when we collectively have to decide for something that isn't a private risk but a public one. And this would apply to pandemic, right? The current coronavirus pandemic risk, as well as environmental pollution risk, where we have to make decisions about how much soot and smoke and stuff should be allowed to be admitted into the environment because we collectively consume the result, even though we have very different individual risk preferences. And the collective decision is much more difficult than the individual one because the very risk averse people and the very risk seeking people all live in the same society and have to consume the same result. So the usual result is we have a political struggle, and environmentalists want much less risk, and then pro growth and pro industry, and some labor groups want more pollution, and then we have a political fight, and then we end up usually somewhere in the middle.
So, can you give us some of your favorite, I don't know if favorite is the best word, some of the best examples of how science has been misused in making public policy?
Well, not misused. That's a. I guess I would call that in the particular. Let's talk about conventional air pollution.
Hmm.
Uh, it's almost all the current not global warming, not CO2, but I'm saying the particulate matter, sulfates, nitrogen dioxide, uh, and ozone, those conventional pollutants from fossil fuel combustion. Those uh, controversies that if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, there's article after article after article that says scientists or the scientific advisory committee were overruled by political decision makers. And see, but the more I dig into it, the more I've learned that, again, if your listeners can imagine an XY axis on a blackboard in their minds, if X were pollution exposure and Y was decreased mortality and morbidity, or increased depending on what. So let's say it's you go right on the x-axis, you have more exposure, and then on the y-axis you have greater health effects, right? So we have what that function looks like, as best I can tell, given the science I've read, is that there's no discontinuity in that function. That is, as you gradually increase pollution levels, then mortality and morbidity get worse. And as you make the air cleaner, morbidity and mortality get better. And but there's no threshold, there's no discontinuity in that statistical relationship. Then the question is, collectively, where do we draw the line? And the Clean Air Act delegates to the EPA the decision to quote look at the science and then make the best decision. We'll notice that's not possible, right? It'd be one thing if we went a little bit to the left or the little bit to the right in terms of more or less exposure, you got a lot more health consequences or a lot fewer. But in fact, it's just a little bit more and a little bit less. And so, where should we draw the line in that function for policy purposes? And if you read the Times and the Post, you would come to the conclusion that you should listen to the scientists. And of course, if you're a health scientist, you always want less pollution. That's just sort of part of the territory. But there are trade offs with economic growth and other things. And so the line drawing exercise, in my view, cannot be possibly just a scientific exercise. There has to be something else involved. And yet, the way the Clean Air Act is written, they can't actually consider anything other than public health consequences. They can't consider costs of compliance legally. So in conventional pollution policy discussion, you end up with this squirrely business of it all should be based on science, but the more you dig into it, you realize it can't possibly be based on science at all. And in the end, it's kind of a arbitrary line drawing decision somewhere along that continuous function of more pollution, more health effects, and less pollution, less health effects. And so maybe just Congress ought to do it rather than making up a belief among the public that there's something called scientists who ought to decide, they know best, and we leave it to them. And that it's actually kind of logically incoherent, and politically though it gets Congress off the hook. Turns out members of Congress don't actually want to have to decide how much we care about health. They'd rather delegate it to someone and then blame them when they don't like the decision. Am I making some sense?
Yeah. So in the US, we have courts and regulatory agencies. So, in your experience, do you think that the courts police regulatory agencies well in the way that these agencies apply science? Or is it not?
Well, it'd be very difficult. There have been well, uh, very few legal people, very few justices major in science. It's very rare to have someone who has a science degree as well as a law degree. There are a few people, and
Hmm.
they're fascinating people to study. They're mostly academics rather than actual practicing judges. But think about it: we're asking a, a people with generalized humanities and social science and legal background to somehow inject themselves into scientific controversy, and they're not capable of doing that. So it's it then legally what's happened over time is various decisions of the Supreme Court basically give regulatory agencies discretion to deal with these things. And the courts have decided that they will not interfere with that discretion, even if it's kind of wildly bad to most outside observers. The courts are currently reconsidering that regulatory discretion, but the uh, thinking through and Cato's behind that, but I guess I disagree sometimes with my colleagues on this. That if the if we were to uh, in effect get the legal system involved a lot more in second guessing these regulatory decisions, it's not obvious to me that the world would be better because
Hmm.
on what basis would the judges decide that something wasn't wisely done scientifically, given that the Clean Air Act, as I just described, says consider only benefits, you can't consider costs, right? So that, I mean, that's kind of, so you've got this, believe me, conventional air environmental policy is just a mess. From It's got lots of bad things going on. One of the main thing though is the way the Clean Air Act is written, which is it you can't consider costs. That's illegal, which that makes no sense. So the EPA has to do this jujitsu dance of making believe it's science when in fact it's actually making a cost benefit decision, even though it's not allowed to do so.
That that sounds
It's
way too it sounds like it's just like pretending to be something it's not because it's not
correct.
allowed to. It's the
A
only
lot of
way it's
life may
possible.
be that.
Like, I just why does it have to be that complicated? I don't know. I guess they didn't think it through that much or something, and they just didn't understand that that wouldn't be possible. I
Well,
don't know.
part of it
I
is again environmental. Remember, so go back to why the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act were passed.
Mhm.
President, right? Richard Nixon
Mhm.
was running. Well, the Clean Air Act and Water Act are from the environment from 69, 70, 71, 72. So Nixon's going to run for reelection in 72, and uh, that was the height of bad air and bad water in the United States. And I mean, you couldn't see in LA, you couldn't see in New York on a smoggy day in the summer. You would, if I could take you backwards to see the amount of pollution, water and air pollution when I was younger, you would be astounded. And so Nixon thought, "Wow, I've got to. People don't like me, even that So I've got to get suburban swing voters to like Republicans more, and the one way to do it is to be for the environment. So environmental activists do not want to hear about and activists of almost any persuasion never want to hear about the trade-offs involved in their policy preferences. They want what they want, and they don't care how much it costs because whatever they're in favor of is defined to be good. And if you're against what they are, you're against good. And it's hard to run for reelection if you're against good. And so it's very difficult. I mean, could you or I run for office saying, well, there are lots of trade-offs in the environment, and I'm not sure how much cleanliness or safetiness we should have. Those kind of people don't get reelected. And so
That's true.
so even though policy analysis as a scientific enterprise that I'm describing, I believe very much in what I do and how I think about it, it's not obvious that anything I'm talking about helps a senator or a member of the House deal with constituent demands and reelection. In part because the public thinks of safe, unsafe, healthy, unhealthy. They don't think in a continuous probabilistic way that I'm describing here, which is there's incremental costs and benefits towards all decisions. It's not that the car is safe or unsafe, it's just more safety or less safety or more environment or less environment, and then how much are you willing to pay to get that incremental benefit. It's very much an economic way of thinking about things, and it is not. That's not how most non-economists think about these issues.
People don't want to put a price on anything.
Not they think yes, they think the kind of discussion I might have is um, insensitive, and it's not. It doesn't. It's somehow um, it's not valuing. It's not sacred the way I discuss things. And if there was an economist, Bob Nelson, taught at University of Maryland, and he was on the editorial board of Regulation, the journal I edit. He's died tragically last year at early 70s. He had an appendicitis in a conference in Finland, if you can believe it. And anyway, his scholarship towards the end of his career was on environmentalism as the new American religion. And in other words, as America grew more secular and traditional religion attendance and adherence declined, something in this environmentalism has become a quasi religion, and it talks about the earth as sacred. And he argued that it was the reason environmental policy is so different than normal budget trade-off kind of stuff is because the environment is sacred for many people, and that makes the kind of discussion we're having very difficult.
Hmm. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about a topic that I guess could also be called sacred to some people. It's kind of taboo to talk about, and it's kind of, I think, misunderstood in a way. So, before I read your blog post at Cato at Liberty on the issue with Jeff Myron and Ryan Bourne, I never really thought about it, which is the value of life or the value of living and kind of the price of that, which is what I don't know, everything kind of revolves around prices. So it's about the topic of how to measure the value of a life or of living and what is a life worth. In that blog post you write, quote, during pandemics, what economic costs associated with regulation should society tolerate to reduce health risks, end quote. With this question, you get right into the debate about how much economic costs should be willing to be taken or paid because of a lockdown or other government regulations to prevent people from infection or from death from the virus, from the pandemic. And you write, quote, so are lockdown regulations such as mandating the closure of non-essential businesses and issuing stay-at-home orders cost-effective means of reducing COVID-19 mortality risk, like child-proof lighter regulations, or absurd overkill like the formaldehyde exposure rules, end quote. So how do you even begin to answer this question? And can you tell us what you think about this?
Wow. Jeff and
Like a
Ryan and
lot.
we're trying to write a second blog post. Actually, we're going to write a chapter for Cato on the value of a statistical life and the COVID pandemic. And we are scratching our heads ourselves to try to figure out the answer. So briefly, let me describe for your listeners of uh, health and safety regulation. We know what the costs are. We know how much it costs for plants to retrofit to reduce pollution, and we know how much installing guardrails on roads costs. So we know costs of life enhancement through safety prevention or safety enhancement. The question is, what's the benefit? In other words, how would we know if we spent too much? And for that, we need to. Uh, there's a 40-year-old literature on in market settings involving mostly labor market choices where workers face firms and occupations that have higher fatality risk on the job versus those that have lower. How much does it take to give them an additional compensation to induce them to voluntarily accept working in a coal mine or working in construction where you can fall off a skyscraper. And
Mm-hmm.
and that literature uses the variation in wages that we observe in the market, controlling for education and all the other things we know determine how much you're paid in the market. What's the additional amount extra that people get when they work in hazardous occupations? Those results are then converted to, given the additional risk people face, how much that if we scale it up, like you get paid $900 a year more if you face a 1 in 10,000 additional risk of dying on the job compared to a white collar job. And so if you scale that up, you end up with what's used in regulatory decisions as the value of a statistical life. And that's now about $10 million per statistical life saved in the United States. If you
That's a lot of
Yeah.
money.
But again, this comes from small variation in the labor market from the safest jobs to the risky jobs. But even the risky jobs, like coal mining, the annual fatality rate in that in coal mining is still only 0.02%. Right? So it's still rather small. The underlying fatality
Mhm.
rate in this pandemic seems to be probably an order of magnitude greater than that, at least zero point 0.2 and maybe even 2, and we're still very uncertain about that. So the question is, if you scale up the VSL to say, if we save a million lives by social distancing and lockdowns and things like that, is it worth it? And the answer is you multiply the $10 million times 1 or 2 million lives saved, and you pretty quickly get trillions of dollars, or as we wrote in the blog post, somewhere between half and two-thirds of annual US GDP, which is a stunningly large number that it would be rational or efficient to basically shut down the economy for a quarter, sort of like we did, to save 1 or 2 million lives. Some economists have pushed back on that. Bob Pindyck at MIT wrote a paper that said this clearly can't be right because there's only $300,000 of wealth per capita in the United States. So if on average we spent all the wealth that we had in the US, it's only $300,000 per person. So we can't possibly spend
Mhm.
$11 million or $10 million to save 2 million lives because it exceeds the budget. It's just not possible. So Jeff and Ryan and I are writing back and forth and writing back and forth, and we're actually trying to figure out how to think about what the value of a statistical life is applied from this usual regulatory context that I described into a pandemic context where it's basically never been used to guide how much a little government should do.
Yeah, I mean, I I feel like it's a completely different thing to think about it in a regular time than in pandemic time because it's just not the same situation. And also, if you lock down the economy, you don't have all that revenue. Well, I mean, yeah, no, you don't because people aren't working. And then, like, if you're paying people not to work, then because they can't work because they're locked out, it's so complicated.
Exactly,
I would have no
exactly.
idea how to do
Well, guess what?
it.
It's not just a teenager that doesn't know what to do. Some of the bleeding minds in economics are arguing quite dramatically now about the appropriateness of VSL and how to think about it. I mean, Bob Pindyck's one of the smartest guys I know in economics, and he kind of wrote this result. And then Jeff and I have been doing some kind of fancy behind the scenes math to try to argue how do you inject a budget constraint into this discussion and how should you, and then uh, again with the guide to answering the question that the public has is what's the reasonable amount of reduction of economic activity given the how many lives and how uh, healthcare costs we save as a result of that economic reduction. The answer is clearly a shutdown forever. That's not right. And probably acting normally isn't right. There's something in between that is, as economists are always fond of saying, an optimal, right? The optimal response
Mhm.
to this. And Um, Usually, economists are very confident that they know the answer to these things, but uh, this pandemic has given many, many smart people to scratch their heads over the right answer.
I mean, since I read that, I just have been sitting around just thinking, well, yeah, scratching my head, saying, well, how do you even, how, how would you, what do we, I don't know. I don't know. But I don't know.
You're not the only
What
one.
I also what I also thought about a good amount was how something like that probably shocks people who think that the value of life, you can't put a price on it, that life is priceless.
Correct.
So what would you say to those people who think that we shouldn't risk anybody's lives and that at any cost their lives are worth, or not even their lives, just anyone's life is worth saving?
Um, it's very hard. There was I was a subscriber for years to a Harvard publication. Harvard had a center called the Center for Risk Analysis, and it was an
Mhm.
interdisciplinary team of scholars, economists, but also psychologists. And they had a bunch of people that tried to specialize and think about what's called risk communication, which is how do we communicate with untrained people these notions about trade offs that seem perfectly fine to a risk analyst within academia, but seem reprehensible to many, as you said, ordinary people. And to be honest, they they I don't think anyone's figured out an effective way of crossing the bridge, because it is a bridge. I mean, once you're on my side of things, of course there are trade offs. There are trade offs everywhere. We have to make these decisions. Generals have to
Mhm.
decide how many lives to sacrifice versus how much territory they'll gain in this military maneuver. And so these behind the scenes discussions about how to trade off the fatalities of people relative to the gains that we get from those fatalities, it actually always it's taken place behind the scenes. But you're right, in ordinary discourse on the nightly news, I would be tarred and feathered for bringing this up. And um, so the best people in the field have floundered for years trying to figure out how to bridge this risk communication gap that I've described.
Mhm.
The only anecdote that makes sense to me in a dinner party context is speed limits in cars. I mean, the, do you know the lifetime risk of dying in an automobile accident in the United States is 1 in 100? 1 in 100. And
Wow.
most people don't think, I mean, so uh, it's large, but why don't people worry about it? Why do we have 40,000 people a year die in auto accidents? And yet that is not on the front page news very often. And the answer is
Yeah.
most people think of the benefits of the automobile as large and profound. And yes, they're costs, but they've sort of gotten used to it. And they sort of think, I've talked to many people, even at Cato, they say, well, that doesn't, I'm in control. I know how to drive. I'm a good driver. And I say, most accidents are random. The big tractor trailer comes out of nowhere and that's your toast. It's not, it has nothing to do
Yeah,
with,
it doesn't matter.
right, you're not in
It doesn't
control.
matter how good of a driver you are.
Now,
Yeah.
most people think they are good drivers, and it turns out everyone thinks they're a better driver than everyone else, which can't possibly be true. So, uh, um, so here's how I go about, which is if we valued life as much as people say we do, or rhetorically say they do, then speed limits would be 10 miles an hour. You really would not have any traffic deaths. I mean, you'd have one or two, but 10 miles an hour, you're not going to kill people. You hit them and then they're injured, but they are not going to die. Well, we don't
Mhm.
have speed limits of 10. How come? The answer is, wow,
That
really, you wouldn't get much benefit out of having a car, would you?
yeah.
So why is the speed limit 60 or 55 or 65? Or in Texas, it's 80, right? Why? And the answer is people become comfortable with certain kinds of risks for cultural reasons, even though they're actually unaware of how risky that thing is, right? One in a hundred lifetime
Mhm.
risk. Um, and so we worry much more about other kinds of risk than auto risk. And so, anyway, how do you get people to think about risk in a kind of rational way? And the answer, the best way I can think of, is to talk about all those who claim they value life infinitely. Um, if you really believe that, you would drive 10 miles an hour, and yet you don't. And so I try to catch them in this logical conundrum, and then they try to wiggle, and then they kind of, the light bulb goes off over their heads, and then they say, "Oh, but that doesn't apply to other things." Okay, cars, okay, but not pandemics or formaldehyde exposure or particulate matter in the air pollution context. You see what I'm saying? So the trick is to get them to
Uh-huh.
buy into the auto example and then catch them being
Mm.
logically inconsistent across risk sectors, if you will. And that,
Yeah.
that's how I've tried. I don't know whether I've succeeded, but that may be a way to do it.
I mean, that makes sense to me. I don't know. But also, I kind of already understand that there is a value of life, even though that's another thing. What are the factors that go into determining the value of someone's life? Like a young person, I think it's someone that's younger than 9, their statistical value is like 14.9 million or something, but an elderly person is 1.5 million. I don't know if those numbers are right,
You're
but
more or
it's
less,
something
yeah.
like
There's a literature that tries to have an age varying value of statistical life, and again, there's somewhat common sense behind it, which is a young person has, to be crude, the present value of their future earnings, which are a lot at stake. Whereas if you're my
that.
age or older, to be honest, my earning years are, getting near an end. And uh, when you're older, you don't produce, you just consume. And so, in a very crude sense that, again, non-economists hate, the willingness of older people. Then there's the question of, would older people spend all their resources to save their own life, or would they want to pass on some of their wealth to the next generation? And so there are actually studies that come up with the VSL for the elderly based on what's called the bequest motive. Do they want to give on? Do they want to spend all their money on themselves, or do they want to pass it on to relatives after they're not here? But yes, the VSL literature says if you have to make very hard choices, then you probably want to save young people and do somewhat less for older people. But extremely controversial when the EPA issued, when there was a whole scrum in the early 2000s in the Bush administration about the EPA officially adopting a lower value of a statistical life for older people. And since air pollution affects older people disproportionately because they have respiratory issues, how much should we value
Mhm.
those older people in a pollution reduction policy context? The EPA trotted out a lower value of a statistical life for the elderly, and all hell broke loose in the media and in the country, and everyone bid a hasty retreat. And basically, we have not talked about it publicly ever since, even though academically the distinction continues in the literature.
Well, so as you said, the EPA had a value of life. They assigned a value to life in order to do cost and benefit analysis and to figure out policies and stuff. Do different agencies assign different values
Yes,
to life?
yes.
So, how does, like, for example, how does that differ between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Defense? How does that play out?
Well, historically, the old way of valuing a statistical life wasn't the way I described. It wasn't based on labor market variation and earnings differences controlling for human capital. It was an accounting exercise which said if you die and therefore can't earn a living anymore, what's the present value of earnings that you would have had that you don't have? And it turns out that's a much smaller number than the $10 million dollars on average. And since the first
Hmm.
agency to have to make risk cost benefit decisions were highway agencies, right? So starting from the 1920s on, the first agency that had a budget constraint that had to figure out how safe to make roads, right? Old roads versus the interstate highways. How much do we spend to dynamite through a mountain to make the interstate straight so it doesn't have to be a curve? All of that stuff. It was DOT that had to do all that. So historically, DOT was the first to have to think about this, and their thinking predates the VSL literature. Instead, they use this accounting exercise that I just described. So they've always come in on the low end, kind of
Hmm.
3 and 4 and $5 million per life saved. And the EPA is now, as I said, in the 9 or 10 range. I don't know if there are any that are above that or not. But yeah, you're thinking if this is a scientific decision, how can it be that the agencies differ? And the answer is because it's not just totally based on science. There's agency history and discretion involved.
It's fascinating. It's just so, I don't know. There's so much there that I don't get that I kind of get. There's just so much. So finally, I wanted to ask you, what is something that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on and why?
I've thought hard about that. Part of me wants to say not what I believe, since the joke at Cato, the joke at Cato is that if you want to know how little we know and how little, if you don't want to know anything, go ask Peter because he's read so much that he ends up being so confused that now he's just a muddle and he doesn't know anything. And so, to answer your question, is I'm mostly, it's not that I believed in something and now don't. It's that I've always sort of never known what to know. If that, I'll give you an example about one of my fields, which is urban policy and urban economics. When I was in graduate school, cities were dying, cities were in trouble, and all the training and all the books I had on
Hmm.
my shelf, and still are at Cato, from Brookings and AEI and in the 70s and 80s. All those books were gloom and doom. Cities are dead. How are we going to get people back into the cities? Well, guess what? Guess what happened? The cities came back on their own. And so all those books that I could show you or that I had to read, all of that knowledge became almost, it just looks totally irrelevant and wrong. And now we have the opposite problem, which is cities are so robust and so expensive that we're now trying to figure out how to reduce housing costs so that everyone who wants to live in a city can afford to and then get a good job. And now the pandemic may turn that around where, oh, cities are in trouble and we're now all going to have to figure out how to decentralize again, right? So in my lifetime, I've seen this scholarship oscillate between cities are dead and cities are everything. And we may see it uh, go back again. And so I'll just caution your listeners that even though scholars are pretty smart people, we're also human and we tend to linearly extrapolate from our current experience and then say it's going to go into the future. And then once you get there, it just changed
Hmm.
completely and it didn't happen. I mean, if you read all these books in the
I
70s,
mean,
you would not imagine that anyone would ever living in New York by the year 2000 or 2020. And yet there are 8 million people still there, right? And yet in the 70s, it looked like the population by 2000 might be zero and yet it's not. So that's sort of so it's not so much what I believe, but be careful, your younger listeners. They'll they'll learn scholarship, they'll get into fields, fields have fads, and a large portion of whatever you're learning in graduate school will end up being wrong. Only you just don't know what.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Peter. I feel like I could ask you a million questions and we could have like a 20,000 hour long podcast episode, and I don't know who would listen to that, but I feel like I would be interested. But I will definitely have you back on because I feel like you have so much to say and I have so much to ask. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much for having me.